Hello, everybody, and welcome to Why Is This a Podcast? Just a quick disclaimer. It's very, very warm in Wales um, at the time I'm recording this. So my fan's on. If you can hear it and it bothers you, I'm sorry, but I also don't care because I don't want to melt on camera. Many people over the past sort of 18 months may wonder, given the pandemic and all the crises, how anybody could believe in God. Now, I believe in God, and my guest on this episode believes in God as well. And I'm really excited to have what I'm sure will be a frank um, and uh, potentially even moving conversation about faith. Um, so please welcome to the show Reverend Marc Owen, who's a pastor at the Moriah Baptist Church in Risca. Reverend, thank you so much for being here.
You call me Reverend again, and I'm leaving this call. My name's Mark, for goodness sake.
I've got to do it. I've got to do it when I first bring you in. I'm going to do it when I first bring you in. I'll call you Mark for the rest.
Okay.
There's a I don't know if you saw Stephen Colbert, American comedian. He interviewed Michelle Obama last year, and she told him off in the same way, saying, "Stop calling me Madam First Lady. You can call me Michelle." So,
Good girl. Well done.
but how are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. Well, like you, I'm hot.
Mm.
It's baking. This is it's unseasonal, isn't it? I mean, it's well, they say it's 33 degrees here. I don't know whether that's true, but
The first extreme heat warning.
yeah, what's that all about?
I know, it's like,
They tell us when it's going to rain. Well, that's every day in Wales. They tell us when it's
for
going to.
now.
Yeah. And now they're telling us it's going to be hot.
I heard somebody say, "Oh, I wish we would have just a bit of rain."
Yeah.
And it always reminds me of the film, the Hitchcock classic Rear Window, which is set during a heat wave. One of the characters, played by the great actress Thelma Ritter, um, she's saying to James Stewart after they've had rain the day before, and she just says a great line, which is, "You'd have hoped that the rain would cool things down. All it's done is make the heat wet." So that's the. So I said that to people. I said, "Be careful what you wish for."
Yeah, absolutely.
I still get Vietnam style flashbacks to Florida. No, but it's really lovely to see you.
Great to be with you.
We've obviously spoken a couple of times during the pandemic, during those halcyon periods where the churches have been open, albeit with restrictions in place. You preached down at Sardis and Anastir, as I mentioned. You're one of the pastors at Moriah Baptist Church in Risca. Um, what struck me before, as I was sort of getting ready to come on, was I think you were the first preacher I heard to actually talk about COVID in the early stages,
Gosh.
before we realized it would turn into this entire thing, where it was like a thing of, you should be a bit concerned, but maybe not as concerned. And you did a hand washing demonstration. I remember it vividly, and it came to my mind just before we came on. But obviously, the pandemic's really affected how we worship. How's that sort of been for you as a as a pastor?
Yeah, well, forget being a pastor. I think just being a man of faith as part of a community of faith, it's been really difficult. I love being around people, Kieran. I'm quite a sociable being. I love interacting with people. Um, so not being able to do that initially was a real problem, and then obviously in terms of what I do as a minister, you can't meet with people, you can't conduct services. I was being called to take funerals in those early days when everybody was so nervous about things. You were only allowed 5 people. Can you imagine that?
At that time, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember families having to decide which children would come to a father's funeral because there were 4 children and a widow.
It's
And then you start looking at, grandchildren and stuff, and none of them could come. So I find it tough in that respect, honestly.
There's one thing that I think that people don't understand about your role is that I think some people, particularly outside of the church, have this idea, oh, it's this sort of pious, self-important person who just goes up to the pulpit, gives a long, boring sermon. You've never given a boring sermon. I want to put that on the record. But they just go up, give the sermon, sing a couple of hymns, do a couple of prayers, go home, and that's it. But obviously, like you said, there's the conducting of the funerals, there's weddings, for example, christenings, which are important life events. But then there's also like the pastoral role. You can't see people face to face to counsel them. So I imagine that must have been tough for you as well, not being able to provide that same level of support.
Yeah, and suddenly we were being told things like you weren't allowed to go into hospital. So there were people who were dying, for whom you would be particularly conscious of providing support in those final days and hours. It's an incredible privilege at times to be able to go and sit with people. None of that, couldn't do that. Suddenly, government was telling people to isolate who had underlying health problems. So we weren't allowed to see them. And as the pandemic took hold, so more and more fear, I think, gripped people, and isolating became, well, increasingly just the norm, didn't it? So you'd bump into a person in the supermarket when you were getting your toilet rolls in those early days, and that would be as much contact as you'd have. But yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the role of a minister is, and I'd like to maybe challenge that in terms of just what I do and the way that I do it. I'm a human being. I've got flaws. I'm not a righteous, pious, mystical character.
It's one of the things I actually admire about you, because you're very, very candid about that. Every time I've heard you speak, there's never an ounce of self-righteousness to you. There's never an ounce of ego.
Well, I can't lie, Kieran. That's the problem I've got. I can't. I'm a terrible liar.
To what extent is that a problem?
Well, it's a huge problem because I think a lot of, dare I say it, a lot of Christians try and project a kind of feeling that I think certainly at times in the past we've been very guilty as Christians of trying to portray an image of squeaky clean, self-righteous, pure, and then the truth is, behind the velvet curtains and the locked doors, people are like anybody else, and they have flaws. The Bible often refers to these things as sin, but I say things I shouldn't say. I do things I shouldn't do. There is this human propensity to always muck things up. And I think, I just need to be honest with people, because the truth is, it's this person, the real Marc Owen, that the God I worship and follow loves, has accepted, has redeemed, has continued to work his purposes out in. And when I muck up and when I don't get it right, he's not saying, well, that's it, I'm done with you, I can't be having this, you're not.
Off you go.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people think that they can't engage with faith or spiritual things because they somehow haven't attained a certain level they feel they need to get to first. When God says, you're never going to get to that level, so let me come down to you. That's what Christmas is all about, isn't it?
Exactly. Easter as well.
Well, exactly. You wouldn't have those things but for the God of heaven coming down to our level.
Like people are surprised. Some people are surprised when they find out that I'm a Christian because of elements of my past, certainly elements of my present. And I say to them, I am a Christian. I'm just not a perfect one. I'm not a particularly good one in some respect, in many respects. You know, I'm not. We've all got. I've got the propensity for judgment. We've all got that. I've got that. I've got ego. Unlike you, I can tell a lie. Um, you know, but I sort of like the entire point is I'm never gonna be a perfect Christian because there's only one perfect Christian, and that's Christ.
Yeah, I just think, the Bible recognizes all of that. It talks about us looking in a mirror dimly. It talks about us having this treasure in earthen vessels. It recognizes our fragility. It recognizes our propensity to muck things up. It never makes out that we're going to be squeaky clean and perfect. The reality is, lock, stock, and two smoking barrels, where you're at right now, whatever issues you're going through, the God of heaven says, I can be in relationship with you if you want. For me, that's just awesome. Whatever we're dealing with. I appreciate some people listening to this, their lives may be really good, and that's fine, that's great, celebrate that. But the reality is, for an awful lot of people that I come across, life is hard, it's difficult, and faith and relationship with God through Jesus is a real help to them.
I think I want to come back to what you said about the kind of the squeaky clean people, or the squeaky clean people. I think they're an alienating presence, personally. I don't know what you think about that, but I think they're an alienating presence.
Yeah, I mean, I think traditionally here in Wales, you look at churchianity versus Christianity, where chapel going was everything. People used to boast about how many times they went to church and everything, and you just can constantly set yourself up for a fall because people would see that behind the posh clothes on a Sunday, the reality was Monday to Saturday, people's lives didn't reflect that. And the criticism leveled against Christians constantly is, well, you're just a bunch of hypocrites. You sing about one thing, and yet you live a totally different way. And so, that can be very alienating to people. It can, if we portray that image that we're squeaky clean and that everything's fine, and the truth is we're not. Well, how are people meant to identify with us, let alone this God that we sing about and pray to?
So I'm totally with you on that. I mean, I'm open about my faith. I'm open about my struggles. But as much as I said I can tell a lie, I am as candid as I feel comfortable being, so that I'm trying at least not to present, a case to be beatified. I want people, look, if God's going to receive me as I am, everybody else should too. There's no way to go about it. I'm not going to get anywhere through artifice in terms of who I am, who I present myself to be. It took me quite a while, I think, to appreciate that.
I think it takes a lot of people to realize that, doesn't it? I mean, 90% of us struggle with issues of self-worth and significance and security. You know, I grew up in a very different time to you. I grew up in quite difficult surroundings. Life wasn't particularly easy. But the reality is, my faith has given me, well, not my faith. Now, let me correct that. My relationship with Jesus has given me the self-worth that I lacked. It's really helped me be secure. I think that's been an incredible thing. And as for significance, well, you know, for me, you know, serving and being in relationship with the God of heaven, for goodness sake, you can't have much more significance than that. So I love it, you know. He changed my life, and that's the reality, Kieran.
That I think kind of feeds in quite nicely to my next question, which I'll ask it in a twofold way. The first one is, what influenced you to enter the ministry? And was it always a clear-cut decision that this is where you would end up?
Yes, great questions. I grew up in a quite a traditional first language Welsh home. So any of your listeners who are perhaps, you know, familiar with that will totally get what I'm about to say, you know. So mum and dad, we lived in an extended family. So my dad's parents, Mamgi and Taki, lived with us. We all went to chapel on a Sunday, 3 times on a Sunday, morning, afternoon, and evening. That was the Sunday life that we had. So I engaged with all of that. And then Monday through Saturday, my mum and dad worked. My dad was a medical rep. My mum was a nurse. My older sister, she's 10 years older than me. She obviously went away and she trained to be a nurse in London. And then something happened which really challenged me. My parents, sadly, my mother suffered from chronic manic depression, and she was in and out of hospital for treatment throughout my, well, from about the age of about 8, I guess, to certainly until I was about 17, 18 years of age. So during those very formative years, you know, they were difficult. My mum was really struggling. The treatment back then was quite barbaric, to be honest. I would go and visit her on locked wards. And there was my dad with his mum and dad trying to cope at home, running the home, looking after me. And it's a little wonder, really. I think my dad just found it too much. So for all that was going on a Sunday and him going to church and trying to keep everything in order, he hit the bottle. And he just found that a way of bringing comfort. So long story short, you know, with my mum in and out of hospital, they both became alcoholics, trying to cope really with just the whole thing around mental health and just the strain and stress it brought on them. And for me, if I'm honest, you know, going to church was a great way of meeting my mates. I didn't really give much thought to the stuff that was being talked about until I heard the minister talk about Jesus one Sunday evening in a way that, I don't know, just gripped me, Kieran, to be honest with you. He just talked about the reality of Jesus being our friend, being there for us whenever we needed him, no matter what. I was a young teenager. I can remember vividly going home, and I cried out to God. I'll not hide that. I asked him straight. I said, "If you are real, please, you've got to help me here, because I am lonely. I am fed up. I was at the end of my tether with my parents. I was, you know, classic, isn't it? I was just nagging them to give up the drink because it was having such a terrible effect on their lives. And yeah, I had a remarkable experience. I had a Damascus Road experience there in my bedroom, and with very, very clear assurance. I knew that God was with me. I knew that he would help me. Um, and I knew at that point, in that moment, that God wanted me to serve him. Now, I'm not going to lie, okay? So from that moment on, I went through a very difficult time. So I'm in my young teenage years. My parents' situation didn't get any easier. They eventually ended up having to give up their jobs because of the way things were with their health and their alcoholism. And I didn't have a clue really what God wanted for me. I don't think my minister had a clue either. So I was going to join the Royal Air Force. That's what I was going to do. I remember going to see the careers teacher and talking about joining the Air Force. I was in the cadets. Really wanted to take that further. The ATC, again, was a great place for me to enjoy being around my mates and everything and do some outdoor stuff. I loved doing outdoor pursuits and stuff like that and going away on camp. So, yeah, I was going to join the Air Force. And then when I was 16, my minister reminded me and said, you're going to be leaving school soon. I wasn't an academic. And he said, you're going to be leaving school. What are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to go into the Air Force. And he said, I thought you said that God wanted you to serve him. And it was like one of those moments where you kind of stood on your head. And I was like, "Fool." Anyway, again, long story short, that just...
There's no need to truncate it because I'm fascinated.
No, it just started me on a path, really. I went to 2 Baptist colleges age 17 to see whether they would take me. I mean, going into ministry that young, both of them said yes, which I think in all honesty, I was trying to run away. I wanted to get away from my parents as quickly as I could and from the influences at home. So both said yes. I made a decision to go to Bristol, where the principal of that college was an absolutely amazing guy who, with his staff, took me under their wing and gave me a safe haven. I think my minister had talked to them just about the situation at home. So I was way too young. But they just gave me a safe environment to explore my faith more, to have loads of experience. I did all sorts of things. I ended up cleaning Concorde. You know, I went and spent 3 or 4 months at Heathrow Airport working with the chaplaincy team, but getting jobs while I was there, working for British Airways, working for KLM, doing all sorts of things, mainly cleaning poop off of toilet seats that had been in turbulent situations. Am I allowed to say that? Sorry. Working in City Road in central Bristol. Back in the 80s, there was something called Operation Delivery, which was a hugely controversial interaction between the police and the citizens of St. Paul's in Bristol. And I went in and worked amongst the drug addicts and the prostitutes. I was about 20 years of age. You know, I learned stuff about life I'd never... Anyway, all of these experiences just, you know, it was wonderful. And I met my wife. That was the best thing about being there. And I met Sarah, and her folks were just brilliant to me. And then, yeah, so I took longer to train than most people. I went and became a student minister for a little while. And then eventually, ministry was it. I was ordained, age 23, and started. People say to me sometimes, "Did you never have a proper job?" And I think, what do you think I've been doing?
Have you ever considered writing a memoir? Because I'd buy it, actually.
Yeah, I don't know who'd want to read it, to be honest. Maybe I'll write one for you. There you go.
I want to come back to the pandemic. Thank you for your candor as well. Thank you. It's it's quite a moving story. And I think anybody watching this or listening to it, I don't think anybody would be capable of just following that amazing journey and seeing how it's produced who you are today. I think it's a moving story. So I didn't make the remark about the memoir chest.
Yeah, and I don't want to come over as that kind of pious person that we talked to. I don't want people thinking, my gosh, he's had it easy ever since or whatever. It's not been easy. And, my parents' relationship with myself and my family broke down for a period of time. I saw God intervene in that in an amazing way. That's maybe a story for another time. But my mum and dad actually became Christians, people of faith, and it just radically turned their lives around, and they got some help that they desperately needed. My dad had tried to kill me on one occasion, and you can imagine the relationship between him and me was just so tense and fraught. But by the time he died, he and I had been reconciled. We had a great relationship, and he knew his grandchildren and stuff, and that was just so good. So I just want to give thanks to God for what he's done, because I just see his hand at work again and again and again.
But obviously, as you know, as most people who know me know, I've got my own history with addiction. And yeah, it does harm your relationships. And you mentioned self-worth. It damages your self-worth as well. I'm not out with the woods with it as such, but I give credit to God that he keeps me going, trying to, do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some people say to me, your faith's just a crutch, isn't it, to help you? Well, I'm not too man enough, to say some days I need a crutch. Sometimes I need somebody to lean on, and I'm glad God's there for that. I make no bones about that. It's yeah, it's good. You keep going, Kieran. You keep going with what you're doing. You are who you are, and that's great to hear you being honest as well. And
like we said, what's the point of life?
yeah, exactly.
Just because I can tell a lie doesn't mean necessarily I want to.
Well,
Pandemic, back to the pandemic.
yeah, sure.
Because you mentioned obviously those harrowing challenges that you encountered early on. How, and obviously you've been talking about your faith, how has your faith sustained you during the pandemic?
Yeah, again, a great question. I think what it's done is that it's brought me back to the reality that my faith is not in a building or an institution. My faith is in a relationship that I have with this guy called Jesus. Because when everything else is stripped away, there's a modern song that we sometimes sing in worship, and it says, when all is stripped away and I simply come, I have to bring more than a song. I want to say, well, I have to bring more than a prayer. I have to bring more than my offering. I have to bring more than my attendance to church. Because the reality is, at the end of the day, all I've really got left is my relationship with Jesus. So actually, the pandemic's been brilliant because it's brought me back to basics. It's reminded me who he is. It's just given me that opportunity to just re-examine why I am doing what I'm doing. What is my true motivation? It's brought me back to that understanding. At the end of the day, I'm a disciple of Jesus. I'm a follower of Jesus, and that's the key thing that matters. So, yeah, he's a man's man. I love him to bits. I think he's kept me. Yeah, he's kept my feet on the ground. He's kept me real. I think I've had to learn to dump some of the paraphernalia of what I call churchianity and stuff.
Mm.
And so pandemic wise, it's been a very positive experience upon my faith. I mean, look, there have been days when I've woken up and I've got a schedule that's as long as my arm, and I think to myself, oh gosh, I can't be bothered. I've had frustrations. I've had days when, I've just gotten fed up with the whole blinking thing.
You just wake up some days and go, "Well, what now?"
Yeah.
Right. So
Usually what is Boris going to, and I'm not being political, but what is going to come out of Westminster?
please be political, please. Please.
But and you just think, where is this? My wife's a teacher in a secondary school, and she works over in England, because where we live in southeast Wales, it's very easy to commute over to the likes of Bristol and things. So she teaches over in England, and just hearing some of the stuff that she's got to contend with at school, my heart has gone out to school teachers. And then I've got lecturers on my leadership team who lecture at the tertiary college here in Gwent, and you hear about the things they're having to do. I've got people involved in risk management. I've got people who are involved in global missions. I've got people who are police officers. And you start hearing all of these things. And do you know what? What I have felt is I just want to try and help these people continue to exercise their faith through those things. Because in many ways, they're the ones who are seeing it for what it really is. I'm not really. They're the ones who are having to deal with all sorts of stuff where faith has to hit the ground running if it's going to sustain them, if it's going to be authentic.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just becomes a compartmentalized thing that they do on Sunday that has absolutely no bearing on their lives at all. So when a lecturer stands up, to lecture, and children are taken out of the classroom because they've been diagnosed with COVID, and then you've got all the trauma that lecturer and her fellow pupils then are going through. What does faith say in the midst of that situation? When a police officer has to go and investigate a situation, not just where people have been contravening COVID, but been getting up to other crime and taking advantage of people. How does faith help that officer in the midst of that? And again, we've got doctors, we've got consultants, we've got road sweepers, we've got council employees, we've got people who work in factories, right across the social divide. What does faith look like for these people as they face the realities of COVID and let alone everyday life? That excites me.
That actually feeds nicely into my next question. I'll let you go in a couple of minutes. But it's about how best can churches support communities in a crisis like this?
Yeah, it's a massive question, isn't it? I think I just want to take a step back. I think the church is very guilty of thinking it has the answer for everything. And I want to take a step back and say we don't. That might seem strange because surely the answer is Jesus. But I think God is at work in places we have not yet thought. So one of the things I think the church needs to do is just listen a bit more, watch a bit more, and talk a bit less. Look for signs of where God is at work. I see amazing things going on in this community where perhaps other people would not say it's God, but I would say there is a glimpse of the divine in that. So, for instance, we have something called the Risk of COVID Volunteer Group. And they do all sorts of things. They do a thing called Tin on the Wall, where people can leave tins of food out on the wall. They'll collect them, and they'll make sure that the most vulnerable and marginalized in our community get food. Now, for me, that's a sign of God at work, prompting people, helping people. They might not see it that way, but I praise God for every single one of those people, whether they've got faith or not. And, I don't think the church has been at the forefront of that. I know there are Christians involved in it, but many of the people are just displaying, I think, what the book of Ecclesiastes talks about when it says God has created eternity in the hearts of men. I think, the Bible says we're made in God's image. So I think people, when they are being philanthropic and stuff, are acting with a divine edge. So, yeah, I think the church needs to stand back a bit more, just listen. I think the church needs to be a bit more practical. It's not all about getting bums on pews and singing, as good as those things are. Hey, I love a good sing song. We help run the local toilets in Risker Park. They're blocked at the moment. We need to get them unblocked. But running the toilets is a great service for the community. We don't get anything out of it other than just being able to be part of the community and do something.
It's about responding to need, I think, is the gist of what you say.
That's a really good way of putting it. And real need, not perceived need. I think the church has been guilty at times of kind of saying, well, this is the problem. Actually, we need to listen more. Sometimes councils are guilty of that, aren't they? Of perceiving a need in a community, but what's the real root of that need? Why has that problem arisen? And again, by standing back and listening, engaging with people, I think that increasingly I want to do that. I want to engage with people. I want to hear their stories. I want to hear what really is behind some of the needs that are in our community. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Final question. You mentioned Boris Johnson earlier, albeit I think by accident a little. But I do want to just ask you about your faith in terms of how it influences your approach to analysing, current affairs. Because one thing I notice particularly in your prayers, you've got a very, very there's a global sweep. And it's never political, but you do make reference to current affairs, to what's going on in the day. I was just wondering how your, faith influences how you perceive the world.
Well, the psalmist says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So I believe, the Bible teaches us that we are to be stewards of God's creation. We have a responsibility for the world in which we live. And that doesn't just mean kind of environmental responsibility and stuff. And I think it's great Christians are getting involved in that stuff. And certainly, I'm quite keen with some of that as well. But I think we have a responsibility to have a world view, not just a micro.
Not just like this myopic.
Yeah.
Avoiding, like you were saying, churchianity.
Yeah.
Just my church, that's it.
Yeah, and your church is, again, very guilty, I think, and I know it's a tendency within me. It's a conscious, deliberate action of the will, to be global in my perspective, because the easiest thing for me to do is just focus on the church, to just focus on that church, its needs, and maybe the community it's in. But it's another thing then to start looking beyond that and see sometimes the ripple effects of all of that. And it's the convex concave thing, isn't it? Sometimes things, from the world come to us, so they impact us. So the global economic downturn, is a massive global thing, but it has found its expression in Risker. Yeah. And equally, things can happen in a small community like Wuhan, and it can expand to a global perspective where...
I'm not quite sure which event you're referring to.
Well, isn't that where the pandemic is, perhaps?
I was joking.
You're a comedian.
I think I missed that particular. Wuhan, the wet markets.
Yeah.
So they're still investigating. But no, and I think it ties back to what you were saying about responding to need. Yeah. Like you said, the economic downturn is global, but it's going to come to Risker. it's going to come to Honesty. It's going to come to Manila and to Kuala Lumpur and San Jose and Sao Paulo. It's going to go everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that's I never thought about it like that.
Well, for me, I was challenged by an elderly minister many, many years ago.
Yeah.
And he said to me, if we don't pray for the world, who will?
Mm.
And I often remind myself of that. I get involved in the training of young ministers, and I often quote that to them. I think intercessory prayer is the responsibility of the local church. I think it's very important we have a global perspective on things,
Mm.
and that we avoid this kind of churchianity club kind of in crowd. We need to recognize that we are called to something bigger. We have a responsibility, and it's very important that Christians are praying and are giving money and are getting their hands dirty. You know this well yourself. I know, because we've talked about it previously. But I think I'm right in saying 2/3 of the NGOs in the world would collapse if people of faith withdrew from them. And an awful lot of them are Christians who have given their lives to serving some of the most marginalized people on the face of planet Earth.
I think one thing I would say is, it's the classic one, isn't it? Knock, the door will open. Seek, ye shall find. I think that God opens the door, and it's our job to go, when we go through it, to decide what are we going to do. And I think that's, and I also think it's our job to hold it open.
Well, that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? I think that, holding the door open, very, very, very important.
Mark, it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks so much for coming on. Hope to see you on again.
Thank you.
I look forward to your next sermon. Hope you enjoyed. Please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. And do join us next time. I'm Kieran Watts. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.